All right, so this is a podcast on which we are going to talk a little bit about the respiratory system. And I understand that we're all over the place. People are doing different things at different times. But now that we've spent some time on the digestive system, I want to make sure that we spend some time talking about the respiratory system. So here are some of the targets that we need to talk about, that we need to meet. The difference between these terms. The terms being ventilation, gas exchange, and cellular respiration. So I hope you realize we're going to do a little bit of a review of cellular respiration, but we'll talk about the context of ventilation, gas exchanges, how it relates to cellular respiration, but most notably how it's different. You also need to know the path of gas, we're talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide, into your body, and how stale or bad air gets out. You need to know what the alveoli are. This is another key term, what the alveoli is and the specific adaptations, actually the alveoli are, and the specific adaptations to increase its efficiency. And fourth, the physics behind ventilation and gas exchange. So there's two separate processes of ventilation, which is we've defined up here in the first target, and then gas exchange, we also define. There's some physics behind it, and we'll talk about that at the end. So I guess we might as well get started right away. Make sure you copy all this down, so if you need to pause, and then continue forward. So we're going to define these terms. So I'll just scoot over to the right just a little bit and see if we have a little bit of space to define these terms. So ventilation. So think about that term and what it means about what you think it means. When you ventilate something, you open up the area and allow air to move. So this is really the process in which new air, put quotation because it's not really new air, but clean, fresh air moves into our bodies, and old or stale air moves out. So another way that you can think of this is as breathing. So think of it, when you respire, you're breathing. That's ventilation. We're moving gas in and out. So the next term, as it relates to this, is gas exchange. So now that we've got fresh air in our body, we've got to have oxygen diffusing across the alveoli. Well, again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Across the alveoli into our bloodstream. Now, we're talking about getting oxygen in, but also we're diffusing, or we're not diffusing, but carbon dioxide is diffusing out of blood into the alveoli. So oxygen is diffusing in and carbon dioxide is diffusing out. And then the third term, which should be review, is cellular respiration. Oops. Let's redo that. I apologize. Cellular respiration. And this is the process by which organisms systematically convert glucose into ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which we can think of as usable energy. Okay? And so let's talk just for a few minutes about this and review. If we remember that, so we're starting with glucose right here. We got glucose. So that's, if you remember, it's C6H12O6. Don't forget, in aerobic respiration, we've got oxygen, and that gets, those are the reactants, and that gets converted into water, CO2, and lots of ATP. And so we've talked a little bit about glucose, and I hope you realize that glucose is what gets absorbed across the villi into the capillary bed of the small intestine in the digestive system. So this glucose, this monomer, this monosaccharide, this carbohydrate, is small enough to move across the membrane into the villi, into our bloodstream, and move all the way around our body. This oxygen is what comes in our lungs as part of the respiratory system. And so that's what we're talking about. But really, this oxygen is really important for aerobic cellular respiration. Without it, it would be anaerobic respiration. And this is the reactant. O2 is the reactant for the electron transport chain, which fuels the last stage of cellular respiration, which gives us that magnitude, that high magnitude of ATP. So oxygen is very, very important to get into our body and to get to the mitochondria of every single cell. So it's got to come into our body, diffuse, so we've got to ventilate it in, we've got to go through gas exchange to get into our blood, and the blood is going to carry it to every single mitochondria so that the mitochondria can go through cellular respiration, the key being making lots and lots of ATP. Okay? So, I know that was a little longer than just 3 simple definitions, but that's what you need to understand about these 3 terms. They're all related, but they're looking at different levels of oxygen, or what oxygen is doing in our body. So, let's move on to number 2. The path of gas into my body and how stale air gets out. Alright, so I've got this diagram here. A couple labels I'm going to add on top. Let's pick a bright color here. So what we've got here is an image of someone's lungs. So up here is the mouth. You don't see the mouth, but here, this tube is the trachea. And you need to know this, that oxygen first, or fresh air first, travels down the trachea, and then passes and divides into these 2 different tubes called the bronchus, or each one is the bronchus. So this is the left bronchi, bronchus because it goes to the left lung, and then this is the right bronchus right here because it's going to the right lung. Now you might be confused because we've got right on the left and left on the right, but this is really as if you're looking at a patient's lungs. This is that person's right lung, and this is that person's left lung. But you're looking at that person, so it's backwards to you. So let's just remember that. So we're looking at the right lung here. We've got the right bronchus here. Well, the bronchus continues to divide into these smaller paths, and those are called bronchioles. If we look on the left side, it's labeled for us. Each one of those is a bronchiole. And then at the end, each of these grape-like things, these circular things, each one of those is an alveolus. An alveolus. So the plural is alveoli. And this is the location of gas exchange. This is where gas exchange happens. So oxygen moving in to the blood and carbon dioxide moving out. So if we were to zoom in on one of these alveoli, and we were to look at just circular structure of it. There are a couple reasons why we think the alveoli are circular like this. This is just a two-dimensional thing, but it's really like a sphere, so it's in 3 dimensions. And there are a couple reasons why we think that the lungs have these structures where gas exchange occur. And one of those reasons is that there's high surface area. Don't write SA, write surface area. High amount of surface area. With this small sphere, there's a lot more edges for carbon dioxide and oxygen to move across. So again, we'd have oxygen on the inside of the alveoli that diffuse out, and we'd have carbon dioxide that diffuses in. Okay, so that's one adaptation. 2, the second adaptation, again, we're looking at target number 3 now. The second adaptation is that it is moist. It's covered in a mucus or a light, thin mucus, and the reason is that these gases diffuse more readily into those liquids. The third is that they are covered in capillaries. So we actually have lots and lots of blood vessels that just come and touch the edge of the alveoli. They wrap around so that as the blood passes by, it's dropping off carbon dioxide. Actually, the CO2 would be inside. The CO2 would diffuse out into the alveoli, and the oxygen would diffuse into the capillary. And remember that diffusion requires, look at the definition again, but requires a concentration gradient. Don't know what that means? Look it up. Be a good review. All right, and so the fourth adaptation is that the alveoli have it's tissue. It's made up of lots of cells, but they have a single-celled barrier. So this orange line is really representing one cell thick. So to get from the inside of the alveoli to the outside, it has to cross one cell, which makes diffusion happen much faster, which is fantastic because then you can get lots of oxygen in for each breath and lots of carbon dioxide out for every breath. Okay? So let's look back at our targets. Oh, and so that's what happens when you're breathing in. When you breathe out, the air that's full of lots of carbon dioxide actually moves from your alveoli into your bronchioles, into your bronchus, and then up and out of your trachea. Okay? Your trachea, note, is very different than your esophagus. Your esophagus leads to your stomach, but they're 2 different tubes that are separated right behind the mouth due to the epiglottis that helps push food or oxygen down one way or the other. Okay? All right, so we've gotten 1 done, we've gotten 2 done, and actually we just talked about 3. So let's talk about the physics behind ventilation and gas exchange. Here's gas exchange. We're talking about diffusion. This is the physics of gas exchange. So you want to make sure you understand what a concentration gradient is and why. Very important that you look at why, not how. Why is it that molecules try to reach equilibrium? Okay? See if you can figure that question out. See if you can figure out an answer to that question, rather. Okay, so let's talk about the physics of ventilation. Actually, let's go back to that picture. All right, so here's our picture again, and so what's missing from this picture is a muscle that, let's see what's going on here. There's a muscle that goes across right here, right under your lungs that separates this section of your body, which is, I hope you've heard of this word, your thorax. This is your thoracic cavity. And then anything below it, which is really where your stomach resides, is your abdominal cavity. Okay? But this muscle that we drew right here, that goes across right under your lungs, is called your diaphragm. Your diaphragm. So that's a muscle. In fact, your lungs are not a muscle at all, so it's very difficult for them to inflate or deflate on their own. It's really mostly due to this diaphragm, which you might have heard your choir teacher, your band teacher, your coach talk about, because this is really what controls your ability to take long, deep breaths and sustain those breaths, which is important for any physical activity. So what happens is this diaphragm contracts. When it contracts, it actually will move down, so this pink line will come down to overlap with this orange dotted line, and when it comes down, your thoracic cavity increases in volume. It increases in volume. Well, when there's an increase in volume, there's a decrease in pressure, because the amount of molecules that are in there have more space, they can spread out, they're not as tightly packed, so there's less pressure. When there's less pressure inside than there is in the environment, then air floods in. And that's what breathing in is. That's when you inhale, you've contracted your diaphragm. But when you exhale, you relax your diaphragm and it returns to this pink line. And when the pink line, the diaphragm reaches the pink line, what you've done is decrease the volume or increased the pressure inside your lungs, and therefore air comes out of your body. So when you breathe in, you're not actually inflating your lungs directly. What you're doing is manipulating the environment regarding volume and pressure. And so if you have great control of your diaphragm, you have great control over your breathing. And that's why it's so important. And that's why your choir and band teachers and your coaches talk about it so much. Okay? Let's just double check that we have a good understanding of our targets. Let's see, can we now do the fourth one? Physical and ventilation gas exchange. I think so. So make sure that you understand this, that you take some notes, and then there are 2 quizzes up on Blackboard for you today that you need to take. One on the respiratory system, and the other on the digestive system. Again, you're meant to take these on your own, so if you can take them now in class, fantastic, and if you can't, get them done tonight and for practice and preparation for your test on Wednesday. Okay? I think I'll stop there.